you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now. We have news stories every day. Now let's go. I spent the past year battling through one nightmare after another. First came my father's sudden heart attack. We'd been working side by side, preparing for me to take over the family construction business once he retired. Instead, Ed Harrington died early this year, leaving me, Nick Harrington, to run the company on my own. I barely had time to grieve before the second blow fell. My wife of 6 years walked out on me. I remember the phone call vividly, my mother's trembling voice telling me Dad was gone. I was out of town on business, so by the time I reached the hospital, it was too late. The funeral came and went in a hazy blur of condolences and formalities. Straight after, I was thrust into the CEO role at Harrington Construction, making all the decisions Ed once shouldered. I worked long hours, took endless meetings, and traveled often to meet clients and suppliers. It was a rocky transition, but I had no choice. All that time away caused a rift at home. My wife, Hannah, felt neglected, despite my promises that things would stabilize eventually. She found solace elsewhere, in the arms of Jonathan Carter, owner of a chain of builders merchants called Carter Supply Services, CSS. When Hannah told me she was leaving, I was blindsided. Me in shock. Hannah, why? I know it's been difficult, but we can work this out. Hannah, avoiding my gaze, you were never here, Nick. I met Jonathan, and I fell in love with him. I'm sorry. She gathered her things, offering to return when I'd packed and left, as if it were her house alone. I remember staring at her in disbelief, but the truth sank in. Hannah was tall, slim, with long, glossy brown hair. She used to be my partner, my best friend. Now she just walked out, leaving divorce papers on the table. Those papers demanded the house, custody of our daughter, Chloe, 30% of our savings plus child support. Stunned, I quietly boxed my clothes and personal items and moved to a hotel for the weekend. Soon after, I found a small 3-bedroom rental on a quiet street, refusing to discuss the situation with anyone at work. They'd figure it out eventually, but I had no energy to rehash the betrayal. What I did know was that Carter Supply Services, CSS, belonged to Jonathan Carter. Whether Hannah approached him or he pursued her first, I didn't care. One bright spot in my misery was Ed's foresight. He insisted on a prenuptial agreement. Hannah signed it without much thought, believing we'd be together forever. Now that prenup saved the business from her demands, my only real worry was my daughter, Chloe. I didn't want her entangled in adult bitterness. We settled quickly. Hannah took the house, got child support, and some spousal support that would end if she were married. Within a year, she did exactly that, marrying Jonathan Carter. They moved into the home I left behind. Hannah had custody of Chloe, and I got weekends, at least in theory. Over time, Hannah made excuses to reduce my visitation, claiming Chloe had one activity or another, or that they were traveling. Eventually, I stopped begging for weekends. Whenever they decided it was okay, I'd see my daughter, but those invites became rare. Meanwhile, I kept hearing that Jonathan bragged about his new family and mocked me. That stung more than Hannah's betrayal. My father's death weighed heavily on me, as did my limited contact with Chloe. I hated how they seemed to rewrite my role from father to stranger. One Saturday, Chloe was finally allowed to visit. She was about 5 years old then. As we spent the morning together, she suddenly asked me a question, calling me Uncle Nick. My heart froze. Me kneeling to her eye level, Uncle Nick, I'm your daddy. Chloe, in her small voice, but Mommy said Jonathan is my daddy. She told me you're my uncle. That nearly broke me. I swallowed my anger. I didn't want to scream at Hannah in front of Chloe, so I let it slide for the moment. But that was the final straw. Driving her back on Sunday, I felt a swirl of rage and heartbreak. I realized I'd been far too passive, letting him walk all over me. Enough was enough. I poured myself into Harrington Construction. I took over as CEO, forging deals with new suppliers. I planned to sever ties with Carter Supply Services forever. My father had built Harrington Construction on honest, fair dealing, and people respected the name, so I knew I could steer my business to other suppliers easily. I contacted existing and potential suppliers, guaranteeing them a surge in orders if they offered favorable terms. Many happily agreed. Then I called a meeting with my senior managers, plus purchasing and accounts departments. They looked nervous, fearing layoffs. I reassured them. Me, at the head of the conference table, we're not in trouble. We're expanding. But from today forward, We will not buy a single nail, screw, or any material from Carter Supply Services. Anyone who disobeys will be fired. Here's a list of approved suppliers. They've promised better pricing and delivery schedules. From now on, we support them, not CSS. My staff nodded, relieved the company was fine, but curious about my vendetta. I kept it short. No mention of Hannah, no mention of Jonathan. The official line was CS and no longer suits our needs. 2 weeks later, we landed a massive contract, a large-scale housing development plus nearby retail outlets and enormous materials order. CSS would get 0 orders. Word traveled fast about our big project. A salesman from CSS approached me offering a great deal, but I cut him off. Me, firmly, we don't do business with Carter Supply anymore. Please leave. He left looking stunned. My secretary Sandra peeked in after. She saw my satisfied smirk and guessed I'd enjoyed that. I flashed her a quick smile, which she returned knowingly. My new suppliers stayed true to their promises, delivering materials on time at good prices. Meanwhile, side projects rolled in. Harrington Construction thrived. The only bleak note was my mother's failing health. She passed away that summer, her heart broken over everything that had happened. The loss of Dad, my divorce, and rarely seeing Chloe. Hannah didn't attend the funeral. She never called to pay respects. That spoke volumes. People in our industry realized I'd blacklisted Jonathan Carter's company. If asked why, I answered truthfully. He stole my family, so I took my business from him. Petty, maybe, but it was better than going to jail for physically attacking him. Some of my managers were Freemasons, and they spread the word among their networks. Soon, smaller contractors and subcontractors followed my lead, cutting ties with CSS. They respected Harrington Construction's approach to business, and apparently me as well. One day, my purchasing head, Bill, told me CCS was losing clients rapidly. Good, let Jonathan see what it felt like to have his livelihood threatened. My father had taught me business ethics, but if Carter Supply expected me to forgive and forget, they were dreaming. While I was relishing this quiet vengeance, my relationship with Chloe worsened. The few times I arranged to see her, she'd been told to call me uncle. My hatred for Jonathan and Hannah intensified. But I held my tongue around Chloe, refusing to drag her into adult feuds. Once, after a particularly stressful day at the office, I realized I was letting everything revolve around bitterness. I decided to be calmer, more focused on the bigger picture. The next day, I learned from Bill that CSS was nearing collapse. That brightened my mood. A year after all this started, Harrington Construction won another big contract. Meanwhile, Jonathan closed 2 of his supply depots. Word had it he was drowning in losses. One morning, a salesman from CSS came to my office with desperate eyes, but I had no sympathy. Eventually, the news broke. Carter Supply Services was shutting down. They'd filed for bankruptcy. Hannah called me furious. She showed up at my house, the small place I'd rented after the divorce, though by now I'd upgraded to a nicer one. The moment I'd opened the door, she stormed in. Hannah, voice raised. Nick, how dare you sabotage Jonathan's business? You've destroyed us. He can't afford anything now. Me, coolly. Hello, Hannah. So nice to see you too. I never told a single soul not to buy from him. I simply refused to myself. Others made their own decisions. Now, please leave. I have dinner waiting. She ranted about how Jonathan's business woes were my fault. I shrugged, uninterested. She left, slamming the door. Later, she called, wanting me to take Chloe for a while. I readily agreed, spending quality time with my daughter. We visited the zoo, the park, just father-daughter bonding like it should have been all along. She was older now, less confused about the uncle nonsense, though I suspected Hannah still fed her little lies. Shortly after Carter Supply's bankruptcy, Jonathan vanished, leaving Hannah with a mortgage and no job. She found work at a local law office, sold the big house, and moved to something more modest. Chloe gained a bigger room. Ironically enough, meanwhile, I kept building Harrington Construction's reputation, forging new alliances. My father would have been proud, I like to think. Hannah never apologized for the pain she caused me, but she softened her stance on co-parenting, letting me have Chloe more often. We established a somewhat civil arrangement. Reconciliation with Hannah was impossible. We both knew that. But at least I had my daughter's love and the satisfaction of seeing Jonathan Carter fail. Sometimes people ask if I regret what I did, banning Carter Supply from all my projects, fueling the rumor mill so other contractors dropped him too. I answer, no. He took my wife, humiliated me, and tried to sideline me in my own daughter's life. I simply responded with the one weapon I had, my business. Unlike Jonathan Carter, I haven't vanished. I remain here running Harrington Construction with integrity, taking care of my loyal employees, and raising Chloe to understand the importance of honesty. That final piece is especially dear to me, because if there's one lesson I learned from losing Hannah, it's that lies and betrayal always come home to roost. I can't speak for Jonathan's fate if he reemerges one day to find no open door with me. The same goes for Hannah in a romantic sense, but for Chloe's sake, we keep a civil front. That's enough. As for me, I go to bed each night with a lighter heart, knowing I reclaimed what mattered most, my family's legacy and my daughter's love, and that is worth all the revenge in the world.